I'm John Merchant, and I'm from Guidewire Cyence in the Analytics and Data Services group. It's essentially an unaddressed risk from a language standpoint within a particular line of business. So an example would be a property policy. Property policy doesn't address cyber as a risk or cyber as a cover or an exposure at all. Therefore, if there's some event that causes property damage and that event's trigger happens to be a cyber event, someone hacks in, for instance, takes over an industrial control system, and then causes actual physical damage, then that company makes a claim against their property policy, that property carrier may not have anticipated that a cyber event could have ever caused physical damage to that company's material, or whatever you happen to call it, and then make a claim against it. Therefore, it was silent or non-affirmative. Regulators globally have varying levels of concern or interest in non-affirmative or silent cyber. It depends on where you are regionally. There's a lot more interest, it seems, in non-affirmative or silent cyber outside the United States than there is in the US. The regulators here tend to be much more involved in the industry and much more akin to this risk, whereas in the US, there's so many different regulatory bodies there of varying sizes that the carriers have to deal with. And many of them are state-level regulators. There's 50 of those. And the level of knowledge and understanding in the U.S. for the exposure of silent cyber, in my opinion, is much lower than it is outside the U.S. So that's an interesting dynamic there, where addressing the risk from a regulatory standpoint outside the U.S. Has so much more focus on it. That tends to push products in a certain direction. They become much more forward-looking because they're trying to address these regulatory concerns. Where in the U.S., the products are going in a slightly different direction, not as concerned about the risk of a regulator poking through their books and asking them about things like silent cyber. Now, that's not to say they're not concerned with it. I just think the level of understanding across the entire regulatory universe, but in the U.S. especially, is much lower as to what silent cyber is. I'd actually say it's much lower as to what cyber risk actually is. Often they're learning from the insurance industry, and many regulators, large and small in the U.S., look to the insurance industry to help them set those standards and define what silent cyber actually is. So when a regulator imposes a regulation or a new law or something along those lines onto the insurance industry, we run the very real risk of them putting a regulation together that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it's not addressing the actual risk. So that's a strange dynamic we see there with cyber. First, to define what silent cyber risk actually is, and that definition will vary according to each carrier or each company. Many may be worried about the silent cyber exposure in their property portfolios, other in their professional and management liability, others in casualty, and others may simply look into areas or look outside the firm or outside the carrier for solutions to help them define what silent cyber is. Once that's defined, then and only then can you start to move down toward predicting and what the actual loss could be from a silent cyber event. But the first step is for them to define what that means to them. Once defined, you can take step number 2. Many carriers right now aren't defining it, or I wouldn't say afraid, but there's a hindrance there to define what cyber is because there could be commercial reasons why they might not want to define it. Insurance companies are notoriously siloed, where different groups work in parallel but never speak to each other. So there also has to be a more holistic or horizontal approach to addressing the risk across these multiple silos within insurance carriers. And I think then and only then can you really get to a point where you're holistically addressing silent cyber risk and able to build a risk management framework around it.